So, yesterday I watched this movie called God's Not Dead, and it's a Christian movie. And I'm just interested in the point of view of like Christians and non-Christians. The context to that is that I have a Christian mother. She's an immigrant. We live in Germany, by the way. She converted to Christianity when she got here. So she's a Protestant Christian, whereas I haven't been a Christian all my life. Nevertheless, I did visit church and I did like consume some of those Christian stories, and I am still interested in it as a topic. And that's why I watch a few Christian movies here and there. Most of them are from the US, of course, or I'd rather say all of them. And in giving like those reviews, I have to like give a disclaimer that I don't know all of the terminology of Christianity in the US or like the structures, and yeah, just forgive like my lack of knowledge there. So yeah, I find it interesting to compare like Christianity in the US and what I have experienced. Which, by the way, my experience isn't like the typical German Protestant kind of experience either, because my mom was always part of an independent church. So yeah, it's quite different there, and just the fact that she is an immigrant also like affects our experience. So the other Christian movies I watch are Remember the Wife of Lot and Faith of Our Fathers, which the first movie I mentioned is like a movie by the Jehovah's Witnesses. So I'm not sure if I should like categorize them with the other Christian movies, but I just will. Yeah, they aren't really they aren't good or even memorable movies, and that's why I want to like give a recap of the movie I just watched yesterday, because like otherwise I would just forget all about them in a short while, and I just want to like capture my views while they are still fresh on this movie. And to be honest, while I watch those movies, I don't pay super close attention, so I might miss some stuff. I might not do them justice or whatever, but I just like those are the movies I want to watch and just let my thoughts wander without paying like 100% attention. Even though like for this recap, I did like go back to refresh some of my memories to like make sure that I got it right. So I hope there aren't that many mistakes in them. And yeah, so the way I found this movie was I just looked up IMDb lists of Christian movies, and doesn't matter if they're good or bad. I'm not watching those movies for those reasons. As I said, I just want to see it from like a Christian person's kind of view, and that's why I watched it. So this review, it's not going to about like telling you it's good or bad, or you should watch it, you shouldn't watch it. It's just like more of a commentary video, I guess. And the movie is called God's Not Dead, A Light in Darkness. It came out in 2018. It's part of a whole movie series called God's Not Dead. So there have been movies before that, and after that I happened to pick one in the middle, I guess, randomly. So it starts out like the main character. It's a reverend. I'm not sure. I guess I can say reverend or pastor like interchangeably. So yeah, it starts out with this reverend called Dave, and he gets arrested. And the reasoning is that like they give some kind of bullshit reasoning as to why he got arrested. It's that he failed to give his sermon to the city, and at the time I watched it, I didn't know if it was real law for which you can get arrested for. It just sounded like they needed some bullshit reason to have him arrested to fulfill this victim complex that's very common for like Christian stories. And they approach it from this angle of him having to like stand up for his religious freedom and freedom of speech. And there's a lot of like protest and anger towards this pastor and the church. And the movie doesn't give you a reason why they are so angry at him. Throughout this movie, there's a lot of news coverage interspersed, and they cover his story. It's a huge news story, and you wouldn't think like, oh, if he simply refused to give his sermon to the city, it would spark that kind of controversy. Like you feel like there must be more to it, but they don't really mention it. And when I watched it, I thought like the only way that it would make sense in my head is that there would only be so much controversy if he had some messed up stuff in his sermon, like think of hate speech or something like that, right? And yeah, this is like kind of the context I was giving this movie. without them mentioning it. But if I didn't have this headcanon, it just wouldn't make sense. The whole movie just wouldn't make sense. So yeah, they are approaching it from like innocent Christians getting persecuted angle, and it's kind of funny to me because it obviously takes place in the U.S. And let's be real, if you are a Christian in the US, Protestant Christians, mainstream Christian, I'm not talking about like any like weird off-branch types of Christianity, they are like the least persecuted religion that is out there. So it's funny that they still like come at it from this victim angle. And it is like very common in Christian stories. I grew up with them, I heard them in my childhood about um, Christians getting persecuted. Of course, it happens a lot in the Bible as well. And the one story I remembered from my childhood was like from this girl in Romania who was a Christian, and she got persecuted like hardcore for it. And it makes sense, right? Like in a country where Christianity is not the majority, like a persecution story makes sense in that way. And those stories often had like a martyr angle to it as well, and stories about people who were willing to die for their beliefs. It was seen as like a noble thing to do, and they didn't really fight back when they got pushed back. They were willing to sacrifice their lives in the name of God. But because like the movie, it takes place in the US, I feel like they want to feel like victims without being martyrs, you know? So in this movie, there's the church on university campus, and it sparks a lot of controversy. The students are protesting it vehemently. They want it gone, and the funny thing is that they show like those protester posters, and the statements on them are so unspecific. Like you can't really tell what they are really mad about. Like the statements are just like God's dead, and apparently like that's supposed to make them so mad that they believe that God's dead, and then Christians believe that God's not dead, that they are so hostile towards them, which, as I said, it doesn't really make sense if you give that kind of reasoning. And in one of the sermons, the Reverend even says, we have to have armed guards to protect us from protesters.
I would think. When he was a pastor, he'd leave these doors open day and night, didn't matter. Now, we hire armed security guards to protect us from the same people we're supposed to be ministering to.
And it was such an offhand throwaway comment, right? Like you don't really actually see the armed guards. And that's what I mean with like, it takes a different angle because it plays in the US where people are allowed to carry weapons and defend themselves. And you know, I'm used to like those stories where people get persecuted and they become martyrs, but in this movie it's like, oh, we get persecuted, but we are ready to kill those who are fighting us. We are ready to kill those protesters if that is what it's needed to protect ourselves. So yeah, there is a lot of like protests to get the church off the campus, and the church and the university, they are in a legal battle to keep it or to remove it. And the main character, Dave, he has a buddy. He's a pastor from Ghana, and they hang out after Dave gets released from prison. And while they pass the church, they see a man throwing a brick through the window, and the brick hits a valve in the basement, and it causes a gas leak. So the pastor from Ghana, he enters the church, he turns on the light, and a huge explosion happens, which kills him. It's kind of a far-fetched freak accident. After that, you get a flashback to earlier in the day, and you meet Keaton and Adam. Keaton is a girl, and Adam is a guy. They are a couple. They are students of this university. And it's revealed that Keaton is grappling with her faith. You get the feeling that she still very much wants to be a Christian, but she's kind of wavering. Whereas Adam, he has been a Christian as a child, but he hasn't been anymore, like for years now. You then meet their friend group, and it's revealed that Keaton is the only Christian in this friend group. Everyone else wants the church gone from campus. And in this friend meeting, they have like this conversation about the Mandela effect, and just like to go off on a tangent here, I always dislike it whenever the Mandela effect is brought up. It's always brought up by people who don't want to admit that they are wrong. And the Mandela effect, it's obviously when a group of people misremember a detail, right? Like the explanation is like, this whole group of people can't be misremembering it. It can't be possible that they are all wrong, so they must have gotten the info from somewhere else, and that somewhere else is like the parallel universe. But like the reality of things is just that they misremembered it. And the example they brought up in the movie is like, hey, did you know that Kit Kat, the candy bar, is written with a hyphen in between? And this was like the detail that everyone misremembers. When like in reality, it's not that they don't remember it. It's just that it's such a minuscule detail that nobody would even pay attention to it. So instead of like misremembering it, it's just that they have never thought about it like consciously to even make it their memory. Yeah, I just found it like the reason I went off on this like Mandela effect tangent is because I find it funny that it gets brought up in a Christian movie. Because like I think the only people the Mandela effect appeals to are people who don't want to admit they are wrong. Like actually I don't even know if people really like believe in this Mandela effect. So after this like friends meet up, the couple gets into an argument because of their differences in faith, and they are close to breaking up. And out of frustration, Adam, the guy, he picks up a brick and throws it through the window of the church. So it's revealed it was him who caused the death of the pastor. And the day after, there's a meeting from the university council members, and they have like zero compassion apparently that someone just died in the church. They were like, we have to get this church off our campus right now. And inside the council, there is a guy named Thomas, and he was friends with the Reverend, and he was tasked with breaking the news to him. And when the guy, Thomas, told the Reverend of the plans to remove the church, and what stood out to me was that the Reverend had really selfish reasons for wanting to keep the church. Like, his reasonings were, it was my father's church, it's my home and everything I have. Yeah, so this strikes me as odd, but it is, like, it will come back later. So yeah, he kind of got a double whammy there with his friend dying, and then he's supposed to close the church. And we are introduced to another character named Josh. He's a former law student. He's now the campus minister, and I think he appeared in the prequel to this movie. He is the campus minister, and him and the Reverend are closing down the church. The Reverend is of course super devastated about closing down the church. He's like he's super devastated. And while he was kind of reflecting on it, being sad, the Josh guy just goes, oh, by the way, Keaton stopped by the other day for my sermon. And it just was such a funny response to me. Because like you have someone who just lost his friend, his church gets closed down. I'm not sure if he really cares about Keaton finding Jesus again, Josh.
You gonna be okay?
All these years, this church has been here. When I think about the work that God has done and the lives that He's changed, now it's just a crime scene.
Yeah, Keaton stopped by the other day. Remember her? First time I seen her in 5 months.
But eventually, Josh convinces him to fight against the church closing down. And so the Reverend, he visits his lawyer brother. His lawyer brother is an atheist, and they have kind of a strange relationship, haven't met each other in a long time. But he convinced him to take the case, and they drive back to their hometown. Meanwhile, Adam confesses to Keaton that it was him. And she's very supportive of him, I guess. A little hiccup in their relationship is resolved. And she's like, maybe you should just stop thinking about it. Like, that's what her response to him was. Like, maybe just forget that your action just killed a person. And he pretty much discouraged him from coming forward. And Adam is feeling super guilty. He asked her, if God exists, would he forgive me? And she was like, of course he would. So it's kind of funny that like her opinion is that he should ask God for forgiveness. but he shouldn't like face real life accountability, I guess, because she doesn't want him to come forward with the fact that it was him. Meanwhile, the Reverend and the lawyer, they have like some brother bonding time. They tease each other like siblings do, and it's I mean, like in my opinion, the writers were trying a little bit too hard with the banter. So their bonding time gets interrupted when they get called to the church. It is about to get demolished with an excavator, and the driver says it's all lawful. He has a permit, and it all takes place on a Sunday, which, and as someone like, who lives in Germany, this would not be allowed here on a Sunday because of the noise, and you are not allowed to do that kind of work on a Sunday. But I don't know about the US, maybe it's different. But the reason it takes place on Sunday is because it's the day of the Lord, and to buy himself time to like hold off the demolition, the Reverend is reading the Bible
cover to cover.
It's literally mentioned like
Cover to
which
cover.
I feel like it would buy him quite a lot of time if he actually did that. And he reads the Bible to like just bystanders in front of the church. Meanwhile, the lawyer brother, he goes to the judge, and the judge is in her church and visiting mass. And of course he's like, don't disturb me while I'm in the middle of mass, but he is like, the existence of a church is on the line. So she gives him the cease and desist document, and the lawyer brother comes back, shows it to the excavator guy, and they leave. Crisis averted. And I have no idea if like a cease and desist would be the right legal document in this kind of case. But anyway, I'm not here to dissect it. What's funny to me is that like clearly the guy with the excavator, he had a permit that said it was legal, so I'm not sure why the judge in this case would have the power, or like why she would even go against this decision, because it's apparently legal. And like, cause like the only reason why she gave them this cease and desist was because she's a Christian too, which I feel it's kind of problematic because your own religion shouldn't affect this kind of decision, right? Like if it was legal, then the judge, like whether she's Christian or not, shouldn't stand in the way. But yeah, because of this impromptu sermon where the Reverend basically just read the Bible,
Cover to cover.
public perception swings back to his side. And yeah, one of those people on the Christian side, they threw a brick into the house of the guy from the university council, and of course he was pissed. Like he was pissed because it could have harmed his family. And who does he blame in this situation? Of course, the Reverend. So he drives to the Reverend's house and he beats him up for no reason, really. And it just like to really drive it home how unrightfully Christians get blamed for everything. And the Reverend doesn't really put up a fight. He gets beaten up in front of his love interest. To be honest, I'm not sure why those like fighting scenes keep happening. Like it's just so out of character, right? But yeah, it's not even like the last time we see a fight scene in this movie, because a while after that, the Reverend gets a text, and it says Adam Richardson started the fire. It's just an anonymous message, but apparently like that's all it took for the Reverend to believe it wholeheartedly. He goes to Adam, and he beats him up. Like again, I guess the reason why the writers would put that in is maybe to make like the Reverend seem more human. He can get irrationally angry too, and just like show a human side of him, I guess. But to me, it doesn't make him like seem more human. To me, it just makes him look like a bad Reverend. Because you think like as a Reverend, he would follow the teachings of the Bible that say you shouldn't be violent, and you would expect him to have a better response than beating someone up. And it is brought up by Keaton too. Like she confronts the Reverend and is like, why is your go-to response to beat him up? Which is a fair point. Like, you are a Reverend, you should have higher standards. And she reveals to him that the text is actually from Adam himself. Meanwhile, the police arrested Adam. I guess for them, the anonymous text message was also enough to arrest him. Either that or he confessed. Either way, he gets arrested. And the Reverend and his lawyer brother, they get into an argument because the lawyer brother is pissed that he would sabotage their case to keep the church by beating someone up. So he drives off, leaves him alone. And because of this whole like beating up a student, the news coverage is again on the side against the Christians. So after this whole beating up scene, the Reverend visits a black pastor and he like seeks advice from him. He's like, why do Christians always have to turn the other cheek? Why can't we fight back? Like I'm sick of it. I want to like stand up for myself and stuff like that. And it's so funny because like, dude, it's literally in the Bible. Like it literally says you should turn your other cheek, right? So as a reverend, he should know that and he should follow it. Yeah, I just like a lot of his decision making just makes me think, is he fit to be a reverend with like how his go-to behavior is? And then the black pastor, he reminds him to be kind, to be patient. And like the reverend's response to that was like, maybe you only think that way because you don't know how it is to be attacked. And the black pastor's response was like, dude, I'm a black pastor from the South. You think I don't have experience with getting attacked? Which I just found very poignant.
And no offense, but maybe you'd understand a little better if you were the one being attacked.
Brother, who do you think you're talking to? I'm a black preacher in the deep South. I could build you a church with all the bricks been thrown through my windows.
You're right, I'm sorry.
So after that, Keaton and the Reverend, they visit Adam in prison, and Adam asks him for forgiveness, which I'm not really sure why it is up to the Reverend to forgive him, instead of like maybe the family members of the guy who got killed. But yeah, of course the Reverend was like, you are forgiven. And later on, the Reverend meets up with Thomas, the council member guy, and he says he pleads for lenience for Adam. He wants the charge be dropped from a felony to a misdemeanor. And early on, like Thomas says in a statement that Adam should be expelled. The state should prosecute him to the fullest extent of the law. So they kind of have opposing views, but regardless of that, I don't really understand how either of their opinions should matter when it comes to the severity of Adam's sentence. Like, why would it be influenced by either of their pleading for or against it? At the end of the movie, the Reverend gives a speech in front of the church, and there are a lot of protesters against him gathered there. They start off with saying like, go off our campus, but he has this speech where he says, I had a revelation that this building is not his church, the people are. When he said this, I was like thinking, about time you realized that, because I found it odd that his initial reasoning to hold on to this church was like, this is my father's church, this is everything I have, like very selfish reasons. But yeah, he realized it's not about the building, it's about the people. So he withdraws the lawsuit against the school. And the funny thing is that he said, I'm also dropping my charges against Adam, which it made me think like, why would he have charges against Adam? Like, wouldn't it be like the other way around? Like Adam would have charges against him for beating him up. And like I don't think like the Reverend can drop like the charge against Adam of the pastor getting killed. Like that's not up to him, right? Like the only charge I can think of that he would have against Adam is that he threw a brick through his church property and damaging it. Like that's the only charge I can think of. But like this whole getting someone killed, that's outside of his influence. But as I said, I don't know about the legal system there. He says he voluntarily hands over the property, and a new student center will be taking the place of the church. And the college minister will continue to have his sermons there instead of him, whereas he will build a new church. And this won over all the protesters. They were just so impressed with him, just graciously, voluntarily giving up the church, and they posted it all over social media. What a good guy the Reverend is. That's the end of it. Yeah, it's a very straightforward movie, just as they usually are. It's very clear from the beginning who is bad, who is good, who will convert to Christianity, and nothing really unexpected happens. I find it's very funny that the premise is of Christians getting persecuted, because that's far from the reality of what happens in the US. The message of the movie is obviously that such a thing can happen in real life, and there are people who try to take away your freedom of religion, your freedom of speech, and that's why like Christians have to stand up against those people who want to silence them. But the problem for me with the movie lies in that they gave no good reason as to why the Christians were so unpopular. Like, they made it seem like really good Christians get persecuted for no reason at all. But like in real life, that's not what happens. Like in real life, you wouldn't have like people destroying churches and protests with so much rage just because they think God doesn't exist. Like in real life, they would be cancelled for a very good reason, and you would have more context as to why they are cancelled, which the movie didn't give you. And afterwards, I looked up if the law that they mentioned at the beginning of him having to give the sermon to the city was a made-up law or not. And I found out that it was actually based on something in real life. It's called the Johnson Amendment. And the real-life example that it's loosely based on is of 5 pastors who publicly opposed an ordinance banning discrimination against gay and transgender residents. And the pastors were subpoenaed by the city to have a look into their sermons. And when I read it, I was like, that's exactly the kind of context I made up in my mind to make this movie make sense. And it's just like funny that they left this out. Because like, of course, with this context, suddenly those Christians don't seem so innocent anymore, do they? Yeah, that's the movie.